By the time that HOA Karen filed her fraudulent lien on my 3,200-acre ranch, I already had the FBI investigating her $2.3 million mineral rights heist, the evidence documented, and her confession recorded. She thought she was stealing from some ignorant farmer. Turns out this farmer had been building a federal case. Picture this: you're fixing a fence post on land your great-grandfather homesteaded 60 years ago. The morning mist rolls across pastures where 3 generations of your family raised cattle. You can smell the fresh hay, hear your Angus lowing in the distance, feel the crunch of gravel under boots that have walked this same path thousands of times. Then you open your mailbox and find a certified letter that changes everything. Notice of property sale. Your 3,200 acres have been sold at auction for unpaid HOA dues of $847. That's exactly what happened to Jake Riverside. And what he did next didn't just destroy one corrupt HOA, it sent shockwaves through the entire system. What would you do if strangers legally sold your family's legacy while you were at work? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, because this story proves that sometimes the quiet ones hit back the hardest. Jake Riverside, 52 years old, third-generation cattle rancher, had calloused hands that told the story of honest work. His great-grandfather had homesteaded this land back in 1960, when you could still claim your piece of the American dream with sweat equity and determination. The rolling hills stretched as far as you could see, bisected by a creek that never ran dry, dotted with black Angus cattle that knew Jake's voice from a quarter-mile away. After his divorce 2 years back, Jake split his time between the ranch and his job as a diesel mechanic in town. The mechanic work paid the bills while the cattle operation slowly rebuilt itself. His 2 teenage kids, Emma and Tyler, spent weekends helping with fence repairs and feeding. It wasn't glamorous, but it was theirs. Then Marlene Whitfield moved to the neighborhood. Marlene, 58, arrived from California 5 years ago with her tech executive husband and enough attitude to power their smart home. She'd bought into Meadowbrook Estates, a development of 47 luxury homes built on what used to be the Johnson family's wheat fields. Within 6 months, she was HOA president. Within a year, she was making everyone's life miserable. "Those cattle are an eyesore," Marlene announced during her first visit to Jake's front porch, her designer heels clicking against weathered wood like a ticking time bomb. Her perfume hit Jake like a chemical weapon, clashing violently with the honest smell of hay and livestock. Property values in our community depend on maintaining certain standards. Jake held the leather-bound property deed his grandfather had passed down, feeling its familiar weight in his work-roughened hands. "Ma'am, with respect, your community ends at that fence line. This here's been cattle country since before you were born." But Marlene wasn't listening. She was already planning. The harassment started small. Jake's mailbox got knocked over twice in 1 month. His cattle gate was left open, sending 30 head of Angus wandering down the county road. Anonymous complaints flooded the county offices about unsightly agricultural activities and potential health hazards. Then came the property assessor, looking confused as he walked Jake's land with a GPS unit. "Sir, I hate to tell you this, but according to our records, portions of your property have been reclassified." "Reclassified as what?" "Part of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA jurisdiction. Shows here it was updated in 2019 due to, let me see, abandoned agricultural status." Jake nearly choked on his evening coffee. The bitter taste matched his mood as he stayed up until 2 a.m. reading legal documents by lamplight. Abandoned? He'd been running cattle on this land continuously for 15 years. He'd paid every tax bill, maintained every fence, filed every agricultural exemption. But somehow, impossibly, his 3,200 acres were now listed in the county registry as part of Marlene's HOA kingdom. No notification had ever been sent. No hearing had been held. One day his land was his. The next day it belonged to a suburban development that hadn't even existed when his great-grandfather first broke ground. The smell of diesel fuel and morning dew couldn't mask the stench of something rotten in the county courthouse. And Marlene? Well, she was just getting started. "You have 30 days to comply with architectural guidelines," her next certified letter read, "or face daily fines of $50. Your barn is a non-conforming structure and must be removed or modified to meet community standards." Jake stood in that same spot where his great-grandfather had first surveyed their slice of heaven, watching the sun set over land that had fed 3 generations of his family. The cattle were settling in for the night, their gentle sounds mixing with the whisper of wind through tall grass. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to discover something that would change everything. This wasn't about property values or community standards. This was about money. Lots of it. And Marlene Whitfield was willing to steal a man's entire legacy to get her hands on it. Marlene wasn't content with threatening Jake's barn. She was just warming up. The harassment escalated faster than a prairie fire in August. First came the cease and desist letter, stamped with the HOA's official seal and delivered by a process server who looked embarrassed to be there. The letter demanded immediate removal of all non-conforming agricultural structures, including Jake's barn, his equipment shed, and somehow even his grandfather's original water well. "Ma'am," the process server had said, shifting uncomfortably on Jake's porch, "I've served a lot of papers, but this one seems unusual." The smell of fresh-cut grass from the HOA's obsessively manicured common areas drifted across the property line like an invasion. Jake could hear the constant whir of their industrial mowers, maintaining grass so perfect it looked fake. Nothing says community like a $500 fine for having the wrong mailbox color, Jake thought grimly. But Marlene had connections. Her husband, tech executive Bradford Whitfield, knew people in all the right places. Within a week, the county inspector showed up unannounced, clipboard in hand and a frown that suggested this wasn't his first suspicious visit. "Sir, according to our records, this land has been classified as part of Meadowbrook Estate subdivision since 2019, Inspector Morrison said, squinting at his computer tablet with the expression of a man who'd seen this script before. Jake felt his blood pressure spike. "That's impossible. I've been paying property taxes on this land for 15 years. Morrison turned his tablet around, showing Jake the screen. There it was, in digital black and white, his 3,200 acres listed under HOA management, classified as residential agricultural instead of pure agricultural. The change was dated April 15th, 2019. Jake remembered that date. He'd been deployed with the National Guard for tornado relief, except he hadn't been deployed. He'd been working at Morrison's Diesel every single day that month, and he had the timesheets to prove it. Here's something Jake's mechanic buddy had taught him years ago. When county databases get administrative corrections, they don't require owner notification if the property appears abandoned. Some clerk downtown could literally steal your land with a few keystrokes, and you'd never know until it was too late. "This is fraud," Jake said quietly, but his voice carried the weight of 3 generations of honest work. Morrison shrugged, but Jake caught something in his eyes. Guilt? Fear? "I just enforce what's in the system, sir. You'll need to take it up with the county clerk's office." Jake's counterattack was swift and methodical. If 15 years of mechanical work had taught him anything, it was that every problem had a solution if you approached it systematically. He hired Kowalski Land Surveying, the same outfit his grandfather had used in the 1960s. Old Pete Kowalski's son ran the business now, and he remembered the original survey stakes. "Your great-granddad drove those markers deep, Jake. Let's see if they're still there." They were. And when Pete Jr. ran his modern GPS equipment along the original boundary lines, something beautiful emerged. The HOA's precious common area, that perfectly manicured strip of grass between the development and the county road, actually sat 50 feet inside Jake's property line. "Well, I'll be damned," Pete Jr. muttered, checking his readings twice. According to the original federal homestead grant, the HOA built their main entrance on your land. But here's where Jake's mini-twist came into play. Instead of immediately confronting Marlene, he did something smarter. He researched her background and discovered she'd been fired from her California HR job for a discrimination lawsuit. More importantly, he found out that Inspector Morrison lived in Meadowbrook Estates, 2 houses down from Marlene. Jake's response was beautifully calculated. He filed a counter-complaint about the HOA's unpermitted storm drainage system, then posted "No trespassing private property" signs right through the middle of their manicured entrance. When Marlene's Lexus squealed into his driveway, he was ready. "You cannot put those signs there," she shrieked, her voice climbing higher than a rusty gate hinge. Jake was leaning against his truck, holding a manila folder. "According to the original survey, ma'am, your community entrance has been trespassing on my property for 5 years. But that's not the interesting part." He opened the folder, revealing Morrison's employment history and address. "The interesting part is how county inspectors who live in your HOA keep finding problems with properties you want to acquire." Marlene's face went white. She hadn't expected Jake to connect those dots. That evening, Jake called his ex-wife Patricia. As a paralegal, she'd seen enough property disputes to spot the pattern immediately. Jake, this isn't random harassment. This is systematic title fraud. Someone's been planning this for a long time. Outside, his cattle were settling in for the night, but Jake was just getting started. The sound of his old truck engine ticking as it cooled mixed with the distant hum of the HOA's security lights. Everything looked peaceful, but Jake now understood he was fighting something much bigger than petty neighborhood disputes. Tomorrow, he was going to find out exactly how deep this conspiracy went. Marlene didn't like being cornered. Like most bullies, she escalated when her bluff got called. Within 48 hours of Jake's property line revelation, the HOA board, all 5 members handpicked by Marlene, held an emergency meeting to address the ongoing violations at 47250 County Road 18. That was Jake's address, and he wasn't invited to defend himself. The meeting minutes, which Jake obtained through a public records request, read like a hit list. $50 per day for non-compliant agricultural structures, another $50 for failure to maintain approved landscaping standards. Somehow his cattle had become unauthorized livestock subject to daily fines until removed. The math was staggering, $12,000 in retroactive fees dating back to 2019, plus accumulating daily penalties. Jake's ex-wife, Patricia, sharp as always, spotted the real trap immediately. They're not trying to collect money, Jake. They're manufacturing a debt big enough to justify foreclosure. The smell of legal paperwork and desperation filled Jake's kitchen as he spread documents across his grandfather's old oak table. Every bill, every tax payment, every agricultural certification for the past 15 years. If they wanted a paper war, he'd give them one. But Marlene wasn't finished flexing her connections. Her next move was pure poison. She convinced the county to classify Jake's cattle as nuisance animals requiring special permits. Suddenly, the livestock that had grazed this land for decades were illegal. Jake's response was to hire Sarah Bennett, the sharpest real estate attorney within 100 miles. Sarah had grown up on a farm before law school, which meant she understood both agriculture and legal warfare. Her first move was brilliant. She requested a complete title history going back to the original homestead grant. "Jake," Sarah said, her voice tight with controlled anger as she reviewed the documents, "someone's been very busy in the county clerk's office. Your property wasn't just accidentally added to the HOA registry, it was specifically targeted." The smoking gun was hiding in plain sight. The administrative correction that transferred Jake's land had been signed by Deputy County Clerk Rebecca Torres. Sarah's research revealed that Torres lived at 1247 Meadowbrook Lane, 3 houses down from Marlene. The correction was processed on April 15, 2019, the exact day Torres returned from vacation in Cabo San Lucas, a vacation that, according to social media posts, she took with Marlene Whitfield. Jake remembered something his grandfather used to say: "When you're working on an engine, follow the connections. Everything's linked to something else." The same principle applied to corruption. You just had to know where to look. But here's where Jake's mechanical mind served him well. He started documenting everything with the methodical precision of a man who'd spent years diagnosing complex problems. Every conversation was recorded, legal in his state, every interaction photographed, every piece of mail cataloged with timestamps. His big break came from an unexpected source: Betty Morrison, an 83-year-old widow whose property backed up to Jake's eastern boundary. Betty had been fighting her own HOA battle over her late husband's workshop, which Marlene claimed violated building codes despite being grandfathered in for 30 years. They tried the same thing with Pete Kowalski's horse pasture, Betty told Jake over coffee at Murphy's Diner, her weathered hands steady despite her age. Same pattern, same clerk, same mysterious corrections in the county database. The taste of Murphy's burnt coffee couldn't mask the bitter realization: this wasn't random harassment. This was a systematic operation targeting rural properties adjacent to Meadowbrook Estates. Jake had stumbled into something that made his own problems look small. Sarah's title search revealed the full scope. 3 other properties totaling nearly 800 acres had been administratively corrected into HOA jurisdiction between 2019 and 2021, all during times when the owners were temporarily away or distracted by personal crises, all signed off by Rebecca Torres. All properties that would be valuable for development or had strategic importance for the subdivision's expansion. The mini twist that changed everything came when Sarah discovered the HOA's financial records were public information. As Jake pored over the spreadsheets late one night, the sound of his ancient printer struggling with page after page of evidence, one line item jumped out: Legal consulting fees, $847,000 over 3 years. $847,000 in legal fees for a 47-home subdivision. That was nearly $18,000 per house per year, enough to buy a decent truck. But the truly damning detail was the recipient. Whitfield & Associates Legal Services, owned by Bradford Whitfield's brother-in-law. Jake leaned back in his chair, listening to the distant sound of his cattle settling for the night, and smiled for the first time in weeks. Marlene hadn't just been stealing property, she'd been funneling HOA funds to family members while manufacturing legal crises to justify the fees. Tomorrow, he was going to start connecting all the dots. And when he was finished, Marlene was going to wish she'd never heard of Jake Riverside. Marlene's next move proved she was panicking. Desperate people make stupid mistakes, and Marlene was about to make a big one. Bradford Whitfield's tech connections weren't just for show. Within days of Sarah's financial discovery, Jake received a visit from the state fire marshal, the EPA, and somehow even the IRS, all based on anonymous tips about environmental violations, improper chemical storage, and unreported agricultural income. The fire marshal found nothing. Jake's diesel storage tank was properly permitted and inspected annually. The EPA discovered that Jake's cattle operation was actually improving water quality through rotational grazing, something they grudgingly admitted after testing his creek water. But the IRS audit was designed to be punishment regardless of outcome. Even innocent taxpayers could be financially ruined by a lengthy federal investigation. Jake's ex-wife Patricia watched him sort through boxes of receipts at his kitchen table, the smell of old paper and anxiety filling the room. "This isn't random, Jake. Someone with serious connections is trying to destroy you systematically." But Jake had been thinking like a mechanic again, and mechanics know that when multiple systems fail simultaneously, you look for a common cause. He hired a private investigator, a retired state trooper named Buck Hawkins, who specialized in white-collar crime. Buck's research revealed the beautiful, terrible truth. Bradford Whitfield's tech company, Horizon Data Solutions, had recently partnered with Chesapeake Energy Development to provide geographic data analysis for mineral rights acquisition. In plain English, they used satellite data and geological surveys to identify valuable land for energy extraction. Jake's ranch wasn't just sitting on dirt. It was sitting on one of the largest natural gas deposits in the county, worth an estimated $2.3 million over 10 years in extraction rights. The geological survey had been completed 18 months ago. The systematic harassment of Jake had begun 6 months later. "They weren't trying to steal your land," Buck explained, his gravelly voice carrying the weight of 30 years in law enforcement. "They were trying to steal your mineral rights, get the land through HOA foreclosure, then lease the gas rights to Chesapeake." The mini twist that sealed Marlene's fate came from an unexpected source: her own arrogance. During a heated HOA board meeting that Jake's new ally Betty Morrison secretly recorded, Marlene lost her temper completely. "We have invested too much time and money in this project to let some hillbilly farmer ruin everything," her voice carried clearly on the recording. "Bradford's connections at Chesapeake are expecting delivery of those mineral rights by December, and we cannot afford any more delays." Betty Morrison, all 83 years of righteous fury, had managed to record the entire 40-minute meeting on her grandson's phone. Marlene had just confessed to conspiracy, mineral rights fraud, and used language that revealed her true motivations weren't about property values. They were about raw greed. But Jake's real breakthrough came when Sarah discovered something that changed the entire legal landscape. Jake's great-grandfather's original homestead grant included federal anti-speculation protections that were still legally binding. Any attempt to fraudulently acquire homestead land for commercial development violated not just state law but federal law. "Jake," Sarah said, her voice tight with excitement as she spread the original 1960s documents across his kitchen table, "this isn't just fraud anymore, this is a federal case. The FBI takes homestead violations very seriously." The taste of genuine hope mixed with his morning coffee as Jake read through his great-grandfather's deed. The old man had been smarter than anyone realized, ensuring that the land would stay in the family and couldn't be exploited by speculators. 3 generations later, those protections were about to save the ranch. Jake's counterattack was swift and devastating. Sarah filed a quiet title action to clear his property deed completely, removing any trace of HOA authority. She also filed suit against the HOA for fraudulent lien and attempted theft. But the killing blow was her complaint to the FBI's white-collar crime division about systematic homestead fraud. Meanwhile, Jake expanded his coalition. Pete Kowalski's horse ranch had been targeted. Betty Morrison's workshop was under siege. 3 other rural landowners discovered their properties had been mysteriously corrected into HOA jurisdiction without their knowledge. They formed what Jake privately called the Grudge Squad. 7 property owners with a combined 3,000 acres and enough legal firepower to level Meadowbrook estates. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Murphy's Diner started serving Justice Coffee with proceeds going to Jake's legal defense fund. The hardware store posted a sign, "We stand with rural property rights." Even the local bank president, whose family had farmed in the area for 4 generations, publicly supported Jake's fight. But the real pressure came from an unexpected source, the local newspaper. Editor Tom Bradley, whose grandfather had lost his farm to eminent domain abuse in the 1980s, turned Jake's story into a crusade. Rural Landowners Fight Corporate Land Grab ran as a front-page series that got picked up by agricultural publications statewide. Marlene was about to discover that stealing from farmers in farm country was like poking a hornet's nest with a stick. And Jake was just getting warmed up. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning, while Jake was welding a broken gate hinge. Sarah's voice crackled through his phone with barely contained excitement. "Jake, you need to sit down for this. My title search just went back to the original federal land grant, and what I found is going to blow your mind." Jake set down his welding torch, the acrid smell of hot metal mixing with morning dew as he walked to his truck. "What kind of blow my mind?" "The mineral rights kind, your great-grandfather's homestead. Grant doesn't just include the surface land. It includes everything underneath, oil, gas, coal, the works. And Jake, there's a geological survey from 18 months ago showing massive natural gas deposits under your property." The world seemed to tilt slightly as Jake processed this information. His great-grandfather, a man who'd never owned anything fancier than a Ford pickup, had inadvertently secured mineral rights worth millions. How much are we talking about? Conservative estimate, $2.3 million over 10 years if the gas rights were properly leased. But here's the kicker. Someone else already knew about this. Sarah's research had uncovered the real conspiracy. Horizon Data Solutions, Bradford Whitfield's tech company, had been contracted by Chesapeake Energy to identify properties with high-value mineral deposits using satellite geological analysis. Jake's ranch had been flagged as a high-priority acquisition target in a report dated 15 months ago. The systematic harassment hadn't been random petty tyranny. It had been industrial espionage followed by attempted theft on a massive scale. "They weren't trying to steal my farm," Jake said slowly, understanding flooding through him like cold water. "They were trying to steal my great-grandfather's legacy and turn it into their retirement fund." But the revelation got worse. Buck Hawkins' investigation revealed that Chesapeake Energy had already drawn up preliminary extraction plans for Jake's property. The plans included access roads, drilling sites, and pipeline connections, all assuming ownership would transfer to Meadowbrook Estates Development Corporation by January 2025. Marlene hadn't been playing neighborhood HOA games. She'd been executing a multi-million-dollar heist disguised as suburban property management. The emotional impact hit Jake like a physical blow. For months, he'd thought he was fighting petty bureaucrats over building codes and property lines. Instead, he'd been defending his family's entire future against corporate thieves who saw his great-grandfather's sacrifice as nothing more than a business opportunity. Sarah's voice softened as she delivered the final piece of the puzzle. "Jake, there's something else. The federal anti-speculation clauses in your original homestead grant aren't just protective, they're punitive. Anyone who tries to fraudulently acquire homestead land for commercial development faces federal prosecution and treble damages." Treble damages. That meant Marlene and her conspirators could owe Jake 3 times whatever they'd tried to steal. 3 times $2.3 million was nearly $7 million in potential recovery. Jake sat in his truck, listening to his cattle moving through the pasture his great-grandfather had cleared by hand 60 years ago. The old man had probably never imagined that the worthless rocks under his farmland would someday be worth more than the farm itself. But somehow, with the wisdom of a man who'd survived the Depression, he'd protected it all. Sarah, Jake said quietly, I want every one of these bastards prosecuted to the full extent of federal law. Not for the money, for every farmer who's lost his land to schemes like this. The taste of righteous anger was better than coffee. Marlene thought she was stealing from some ignorant country boy who wouldn't know how to fight back. Instead, she'd picked a fight with 3 generations of American determination, backed by federal law and mineral rights worth enough to buy half the county. Jake's great-grandfather had always said the land would take care of the family if the family took care of the land. 60 years later, the old man was still keeping his promises. Now it was time to make Marlene pay for underestimating both of them. Sarah Bennett's law office became War Room Central, and Jake learned that legal warfare required the same methodical approach as rebuilding a diesel engine, except instead of parts and tools, they were assembling evidence and allies. First, we clear your title completely, Sarah explained, spreading documents across her conference table like a general planning an invasion. Quiet title action removes any cloud on your ownership. Second, we sue the HOA for fraudulent lien and attempted theft. Third, we file federal charges for homestead fraud. But Sarah's real genius was bringing in reinforcements. She contacted Maria Santos, a civil rights attorney who specialized in housing discrimination cases. Maria took one look at Marlene's documented comments about preserving community standards and inappropriate residents, and saw a pattern of targeting rural landowners based on class and lifestyle. This isn't just property fraud, Maria said, her voice carrying the intensity of someone who'd fought corporate bullies her entire career. This is systematic discrimination disguised as community improvement. Jake's role was documenting damages with the precision of a mechanic's logbook. Every legal fee, every lost day of work, every repair needed because of sabotage. The numbers were staggering. $43,000 in direct costs, plus lost agricultural income and property improvements he couldn't complete while fighting legal battles. But the real weapon was Buck Hawkins' financial forensic work. The retired state trooper had a talent for following money trails, and the HOA's books told a story of corruption that would make a politician blush. They've been systematically looting this HOA for 3 years, Buck reported, his weathered hands pointing to spreadsheet entries that added up to grand larceny. Legal fees to Bradford's brother-in-law, consulting contracts to shell companies owned by Marlene's relatives, maintenance contracts at 3 times market rate to companies that barely exist. The most damning discovery was a series of emails Buck had obtained through his law enforcement contacts. Marlene and Bradford had been planning the mineral rights acquisition for over 2 years, carefully researching which properties to target and how to manufacture legal justifications for foreclosure. Meanwhile, Jake was building his coalition of rural resistance. Pete Kowalski brought his horse ranch problems to the team. Betty Morrison contributed her secret recordings of HOA meetings. 3 other targeted landowners joined the lawsuit as co-plaintiffs, turning individual harassment into a class-action conspiracy case. The community support was overwhelming. Jake's old boss at Morrison's Diesel started a legal defense fund that raised $12,000 in 2 weeks. The local Farmers Association voted unanimously to provide expert witnesses about agricultural practices. Even the Methodist Church, where Jake's family had attended for 3 generations, offered their fellowship hall for strategy meetings. Sarah coordinated everything with military precision. She filed the quiet title action on Monday, the fraud lawsuit on Wednesday, and the federal complaint on Friday. By the following Monday, Marlene was facing legal attacks on 4 different fronts simultaneously. Jake's personal preparation was equally methodical. He took temporary leave from his mechanic job to focus entirely on the legal battle. His kids, Emma and Tyler, moved back to the ranch full-time to help with cattle operations. Even his ex-wife Patricia, despite their complicated history, provided paralegal support during evening strategy sessions. The psychological warfare was Sarah's idea. Instead of hiding from media attention, they embraced it. Tom Bradley's newspaper series had caught the attention of agricultural publications statewide. Sarah arranged interviews that painted Jake as the symbol of rural property rights under corporate attack. Every time Marlene sees your face in the paper, Sarah explained, she's reminded that this isn't going away quietly. Corporate bullies depend on victims staying silent and isolated. But Jake's favorite part of the preparation was the security upgrades. Buck Hawkins helped him install a surveillance system that would make the FBI proud. Every inch of Jake's property was now monitored by cameras that uploaded directly to cloud storage. If Marlene wanted to escalate to sabotage, she'd be handing them video evidence for federal prosecution. The smell of fresh coffee and determination filled Sarah's conference room during their final planning session. Maps covered the walls showing property lines, mineral surveys, and HOA boundaries. Evidence boxes were stacked to the ceiling. Phone records, financial documents, and email printouts created a paper trail that led directly to Marlene's conspiracy. "Jake," Sarah said, reviewing their timeline one final time, "in 60 days, we're going to present this case to a federal judge. Everything has to be perfect." Jake leaned back in his chair, thinking about his great-grandfather clearing this land with nothing but determination and a strong back. The old man had faced down the depression, drought, and economic collapse. Marlene Whitfield was just another obstacle to overcome. "Sarah," Jake said, his voice carrying 3 generations of stubborn resolve, "we're not just going to present this case. We're going to destroy them so completely that no HOA will ever try this scam again." The taste of justice was sweeter than honey, and Jake was ready to serve it. Cornered animals are dangerous, and Marlene Whitfield was about to prove just how vicious a suburban predator could become when her $1 million scheme started crumbling. The sabotage began subtly. Jake's cattle water troughs, which had provided clean drinking water for decades, suddenly reeked of motor oil. 30 head of Black Angus cattle stood around contaminated water sources, confused and thirsty, while Jake worked frantically to flush the systems and provide emergency water supplies. But Jake had learned from his grandfather's stories about range wars in the old days. Desperate people escalated, and escalation left evidence. Every contaminated trough was photographed, every gallon of ruined water documented, every vet bill for cattle health checks carefully cataloged. The fence cutting came next. Jake woke up to find his eastern boundary fence severed in 3 places, releasing his entire herd onto County Road 18 at 5 in the morning. The sound of 18-wheelers air braking to avoid cattle was the kind of wake-up call that aged a man 10 years in 10 seconds. Buck Hawkins' security cameras caught everything. At 2:17 a.m., a figure in dark clothing had methodically cut fence wire with bolt cutters. The figure moved with purpose, knew exactly where to cut for maximum chaos, and was careful to avoid the main surveillance positions. Almost like someone had studied the ranch layout extensively, Jake spent 6 hours rounding up cattle with help from neighboring ranchers, the smell of diesel exhaust and road dust mixing with his growing anger. But his mechanical mind was already working. The saboteur had avoided the obvious camera positions but hadn't thought about the wildlife cameras Jake used to monitor creek crossings. When Buck reviewed the wildlife footage, they hit the jackpot. Bradford Whitfield's Mercedes, license plate clearly visible, parked on the county road at 2:15 a.m. Bradford himself, tech executive turned midnight fence cutter, climbing through Jake's pasture with wire cutters and a flashlight. "Amateur," Buck muttered, watching the crystal-clear footage of Bradford's criminal trespass. 20 years of corporate boardrooms made him forget that crime requires skill. But Marlene wasn't finished. Anonymous tips flooded the IRS about Jake's unreported agricultural income. Environmental complaints claimed he was illegally dumping chemicals into the creek. Fire safety violations alleged improper propane storage. Each complaint required official investigations, legal responses, and time Jake couldn't spare. The mini-twist came when Jake realized the complaint patterns matched Marlene's corporate HR background perfectly. She was systematically filing every type of regulatory harassment she'd learned during her California career, trying to overwhelm Jake with bureaucratic warfare. Jake's counterattack was beautifully simple. Instead of defending against each complaint individually, he documented the pattern. Sarah filed a federal harassment lawsuit showing 23 separate false complaints filed within 6 weeks, all traceable back to Marlene through IP addresses and filing patterns. But Marlene's desperation reached new heights when she attempted direct bribery. County Inspector Morrison found an envelope containing $5,000 in cash slipped under his truck windshield, along with a note suggesting Jake's barn might accidentally fail inspection if Morrison needed vacation money. Morrison, already nervous about his connection to the scheme, immediately contacted the sheriff. The cash was photographed, fingerprinted, and traced back to a bank withdrawal from Marlene's personal account. Her handwriting analysis confirmed what everyone already knew. Marlene had just committed a felony while under federal investigation. Jake's 17-year-old son, Tyler, proved surprisingly helpful with the electronic warfare. Growing up with smartphones made him naturally paranoid about digital privacy. When Tyler noticed their home internet was suspiciously slow, he discovered someone was monitoring their wireless network from a van parked on county property. "Dad," Tyler said, showing Jake his laptop screen displaying network traffic analysis. "Someone's been reading our emails for 3 weeks." Buck's investigation revealed the van belonged to a private detective agency hired by Horizon Data Solutions. Bradford had commissioned professional surveillance of Jake's legal strategy, hoping to stay one step ahead of the federal investigation. But here's what Bradford hadn't considered. Federal investigators don't appreciate private citizens interfering with ongoing criminal cases. When Sarah informed the FBI about the electronic surveillance, Bradford's tech company became the target of its own federal investigation for obstruction of justice. The community response to the escalating sabotage was immediate and overwhelming. Local ranchers began patrolling Jake's property in shifts. Murphy's Diner started refusing service to anyone associated with Meadowbrook Estates. The hardware store owner posted a sign, "HOA board members not welcome." Jake stood in his kitchen, listening to police radios crackling as deputies investigated the latest incident. The bitter taste of contaminated coffee reminded him that Marlene was willing to poison his cattle to steal his land. But every crime she committed was another nail in her legal coffin. "Tyler," Jake said, watching his son expertly secure their computer network, "your great-great-grandfather never imagined his land would be defended with digital forensics." Tyler grinned. "Different war, same enemy, Dad. People who think they can take what's not theirs." Outside, Jake's cattle were settling into their night routine, protected now by cameras, neighbors, and the full attention of federal law enforcement. Marlene had escalated herself straight into federal prison. When physical sabotage failed, Marlene turned to psychological warfare with the viciousness of someone who'd spent decades destroying careers in corporate HR departments. The character assassination began with fake social media profiles spreading rumors about Jake's dangerous instability and history of violence. Anonymous posts claimed he'd threatened Marlene with physical harm, that his divorce was caused by domestic abuse, that his cattle operation was a front for illegal activities. Each lie was carefully crafted to sound plausible to people who didn't know Jake personally, but Marlene had underestimated small-town loyalty. Within hours of the first fake post, Jake's ex-wife Patricia published a public Facebook response that scorched the earth under Marlene's lies. "I've known Jake Riverside for 22 years, married him for 15, and divorced him for reasons that had nothing to do with his character," Patricia wrote. "He's one of the most honest, hard-working men I've ever known. Anyone spreading lies about him is either misinformed or malicious, and I suspect the latter." The post got 300 likes and 47 shares in the first day. Jake's diesel mechanic customers, cattle buyers, and 3 generations of neighbors rallied with testimonials that painted him as exactly what he was, a decent man defending his family's legacy against corporate thieves. Sarah documented every fake profile, every false post, every attempt at digital defamation. Cyberstalking and harassment carried serious penalties, especially when part of an ongoing federal investigation. Marlene was building her own prison sentence one lie at a time. But the most dangerous escalation came when Marlene began targeting Jake's children. Anonymous calls to Child Protective Services claimed Emma and Tyler were living in unsafe conditions on the ranch. The complaints alleged inadequate supervision, dangerous farm equipment access, and exposure to an unstable father figure. The CPS investigation was thorough and invasive. Social workers interviewed the kids at school, inspected every building on the ranch, and questioned neighbors about Jake's parenting. The smell of fear and bureaucratic intrusion filled Jake's kitchen as he answered endless questions about his children's well-being. Emma, now 18 and fierce with protective anger, recorded her CPS interview with permission. "My father is the most responsible person I know," she told the social worker. "Anyone claiming otherwise has never seen him work 18-hour days to keep food on our table and cattle healthy." The CPS case was dismissed within 2 weeks, but the damage was done. Jake had been forced to hire a family law attorney, miss work for interviews, and explain to his children why strangers were questioning their safety. The emotional toll was exactly what Marlene had intended. Jake's counter-strategy was pure genius. Instead of hiding from the smear campaign, he embraced transparency. Tom Bradley's newspaper ran a feature story about a day in the life of Jake Riverside, complete with photos of him working with cattle, repairing equipment, and helping his kids with homework. The article's most powerful moment came when Tyler, 17 and mature beyond his years, spoke directly to the camera. "People are lying about my dad because he won't let them steal our family's land. That tells you everything you need about who's right and who's wrong." But Marlene's final desperate gambit revealed just how deep the corruption went. She offered Jake a settlement of $50,000 to drop all lawsuits and quietly transfer the mineral rights to Meadowbrook Estates Development Corporation. The offer came through an intermediary, a lawyer Jake had never heard of, representing concerned community members who wanted to avoid prolonged litigation. $50,000 for mineral rights worth $2.3 million. The insulting lowball offer proved Marlene still thought she was dealing with an ignorant farmer who didn't understand his land's value. Sarah's response was magnificent. She scheduled a press conference to address the HOA's settlement offer, then invited every media outlet within 100 miles. The visual of Jake standing in front of his great-grandfather's barn, declining chump change for his family's legacy, made headlines across 3 counties. $50,000 for $2.3 million in mineral rights? Jake said into the cameras, his voice carrying 3 generations of stubborn pride. "That's not a settlement. That's final proof they've been planning to rob me blind from the beginning." The mini twist that sealed Marlene's fate came from her own desperation. In a recorded phone call to the intermediary lawyer, a call Buck Hawkins had anticipated and legally captured, Marlene lost control completely. "Just threaten him with bankruptcy." Her voice was clear and unmistakable. "Threaten his children's college funds. Threaten everything he owns. Bradford's connections at Chesapeake are getting impatient, and we need those mineral rights transferred before the federal investigation gets any deeper." Bradford Whitfield finally understood what his wife had cost them. Within 24 hours, he filed for divorce and hired his own attorney. Horizon Data Solutions issued a public statement distancing the company from any HOA activities. Even Marlene's own board members began resigning to avoid criminal liability. Jake stood in his pasture that evening, watching his cattle graze peacefully under a sunset his great-grandfather had seen thousands of times before. The taste of victory was sweet, but the war wasn't over yet. Tomorrow, the whole county would witness Marlene's final public humiliation. The county commissioners' meeting on October 15th wasn't just about property rights. It was about justice, and half the county came to witness it. The courthouse steps were packed by 7 a.m., 2 hours before the meeting started. Farmers in clean work shirts stood next to suburban families, all united by the simple principle that stealing land was wrong regardless of who did it. 3 local TV stations set up cameras, their reporters interviewing anyone willing to talk about the HOA scandal that rocked rural America. Jake arrived early with Sarah, both carrying boxes of evidence that represented months of methodical preparation. The smell of fresh coffee and nervous energy filled the courthouse lobby as supporters wished him luck. Betty Morrison, 83 years old and fierce as a badger, patted his arm with hands that had worked this land longer than Marlene had been alive. "Your great-grandfather would be proud, son," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd survived the Depression, 2 wars, and countless bureaucratic battles. Marlene arrived 15 minutes late with the expensive suit and a lawyer who looked like he charged $500 an hour. Her usual confidence was cracking at the edges. Dark circles under her eyes, hands that trembled slightly as she organized her papers, the desperate look of someone who knew the walls were closing in. The commissioner's chamber was standing room only. County Commissioner Williams, whose own family had farmed in the area for 4 generations, called the meeting to order with unusual formality. "We're here to review allegations of improper property registry changes and potential abuse of HOA authority over agricultural land." Sarah's presentation was devastating and methodical. She started with the timeline, how Jake's property was mysteriously added to the HOA registry in 2019 without notification. She showed the fraudulent justification, claims that Jake was absent when he could prove he'd worked every day that month. She revealed the financial motive, $2.3 million in mineral rights that Chesapeake Energy was expecting to acquire through HOA foreclosure. "This wasn't petty neighborhood harassment," Sarah told the packed room, her voice carrying to the back rows where farmers stood with their arms crossed. "This was industrial theft disguised as community improvement." The crowd murmured angrily as Sarah displayed Bradford's surveillance records, the contaminated water troughs, the cut fences, the attempted bribery. Every crime was documented with photographs, police reports, and timestamps that painted a picture of systematic criminal conspiracy. But the moment that broke Marlene came when Sarah played the audio recording of Marlene's conversation with the intermediary lawyer. Her own voice, clear and unmistakable, admitting the entire conspiracy to steal Jake's mineral rights for Chesapeake Energy. Just threaten him with bankruptcy, threaten his children's college funds. We need those mineral rights transferred before the federal investigation gets any deeper. The silence in the chamber was deafening. 200 people heard Marlene confess to extortion, conspiracy, and attempted theft of a family's entire legacy. Several commissioners looked physically sick. The expensive lawyer beside Marlene was frantically scribbling notes, probably calculating how quickly he could withdraw from the case. Marlene tried to salvage the unsalvageable. She stood up, her voice climbing to that familiar shriek that had terrorized the neighborhood for months. This is a witch hunt. Jake Riverside is an unfit property owner who doesn't maintain community standards. His agricultural activities are incompatible with residential development. The racist undertones were unmistakable. Jake represented everything Marlene despised about rural life. Honest work, generational stability, independence from corporate control. Her mask had finally slipped completely, revealing the entitled bigotry underneath. That's when federal agent Rebecca Torres stepped forward from the back of the room. Not the county clerk Rebecca Torres. This was FBI Special Agent Torres, who'd been investigating the case for 3 weeks. Mrs. Marlene Whitfield, Agent Torres said, her badge clearly visible as she approached the defendant's table. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted theft of federal homestead land, and violation of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. The courtroom erupted. Camera flashes lit up the room as handcuffs clicked around Marlene's wrists. Her expensive lawyer was already backing away, clearly wanting no association with a federal RICO defendant. The crowd's cheers were loud enough to rattle the old courthouse windows, but Jake's statement was what made the moment legendary. Standing at the podium with 3 generations of quiet dignity, he looked directly at the cameras. This was never about me versus the HOA, he said, his voice steady and strong. This was about protecting every American's right to own property without fear of corporate theft. My great-grandfather homesteaded this land with nothing but determination and honest work. Today, those same values won against greed and corruption. The standing ovation lasted 3 full minutes. Commissioner Williams gavelled for order, but even he was wiping his eyes. Outside, car horns were honking in celebration. Inside, Marlene was led away in handcuffs while cameras captured every humiliating step. Justice had been served with the full force of federal law, witnessed by everyone who mattered, and recorded for history. 6 months later, Jake stood on the same hill where this story began, but everything had changed for the better. The legal resolution was swift and comprehensive. Marlene pleaded guilty to federal conspiracy charges and received 18 months in federal prison, plus 3 years supervised probation. Bradford's divorce was finalized with him losing half his assets to pay restitution. The corrupt county clerk, Rebecca Torres, was fired and faced her own criminal charges for falsifying public records. More importantly, the county implemented the Riverside Protocol, new rules requiring certified mail notification to all property owners before any registry changes, plus a mandatory 30-day appeal period. Sarah Bennett was appointed to the county's new Property Rights Review Board, ensuring no family would face what Jake had endured. The financial outcome exceeded everyone's expectations. The HOA was ordered to pay Jake $347,000 in damages, legal fees, and punitive awards. Chesapeake Energy, embarrassed by the scandal, offered Jake a legitimate mineral rights lease worth $2.8 million over 15 years, more than the original fraudulent scheme would have netted the conspirators. But Jake's real victory was what he did with that money. He established the Homestead Heritage Foundation, providing free legal assistance to rural property owners facing corporate harassment. The foundation's first case helped a Nebraska farmer defeat an energy company trying to claim his water rights through eminent domain abuse. Every rural family deserves what my great-grandfather gave me, Jake told the foundation's board, meeting in the same courthouse where Marlene had been arrested. The right to own land without fear of theft, by people with better lawyers. The personal healing was just as important. Jake's relationship with his ex-wife Patricia had improved dramatically through their shared struggle. She'd seen him at his best under extreme pressure, defending not just property, but principles. Their children, Emma and Tyler, gained new respect for their father's quiet strength and their family's deep roots. Jake reduced his mechanic work to part-time, focusing on expanding the cattle operation with his mineral rights income. The ranch now supported 50 head of premium Black Angus, with plans for organic certification and direct-to-consumer beef sales. Emma, now in college studying agricultural law, planned to join Sarah's practice after graduation. The broader impact reached the state legislature. Senator Patricia Hawkins, whose own family had lost farmland to corporate manipulation, introduced the Rural Property Protection Act. The bill required notification to property owners before registry changes, created appeal processes for disputed HOA authority, and established severe penalties for fraudulent land acquisition schemes. Jake testified at the state capitol, sharing his story with lawmakers who understood that rural votes depended on rural property rights. The bill passed unanimously, with Marlene's mugshot displayed prominently during floor debates about corporate land theft. But Jake's favorite outcome was the annual Freedom Ranch Days festival, held every October on his property. What started as a celebration of his legal victory had become a community tradition celebrating rural values and property rights. Local families brought picnic lunches, kids learned about cattle ranching, and live music echoed across the same pastures Marlene had tried to steal. This year's festival drew over 800 people. Tom Bradley's newspaper covered it as a celebration of justice served. Local politicians made speeches about protecting family farms. Sarah Bennett was honored as Rural Attorney of the Year by the State Bar Association. The conservation easement Jake established protected 500 acres in perpetuity, ensuring his great-grandfather's land would never be subdivided into strip malls or suburban developments. The easement's dedication plaque read simply, "Preserved for future generations by the Riverside family, American farmers since 1960. Standing on his hill at sunset, Jake could see cattle grazing where Marlene had planned gas wells, children playing where she'd envisioned commercial development, families celebrating where she'd plotted corporate theft. The sweet smell of success mixed with honest farm odors, hay, cattle, and the rich earth his great-grandfather had trusted him to protect. His phone buzzed with a text from a farmer in Oregon facing similar HOA harassment. Sarah's practice was expanding nationally, handling agricultural rights cases from coast to coast. The foundation had funded 12 successful defenses against corporate land grabs in 6 states. Jake smiled, thinking about his great-grandfather's promise that the land would take care of the family if the family took care of the land. 60 years later, that promise was still keeping itself. Now it's your turn. Drop a comment telling us your worst HOA experience and whether this story gives you hope for fighting back against petty tyrants. Hit that subscribe button if you love seeing the underdog win against corrupt systems, because we've got more property rights battles coming your way. After all, American land belongs to American families, not corporate thieves.
That's all for today's HOA madness. If watching justice serve itself made your day, smash that like button, share your thoughts down below, and make sure you're subscribed. More outrageous neighborhood showdowns are just around the corner.